Okay, so in this lesson, we're going to start applying everything we've been talking about and sort of summarizing it using staff notation. So I hope that you've watched the previous lessons about staff notation and more precisely about how the staff indicates different interval sizes, right? Whether they are even sizes, odd sizes, whether they are unisons, steps, skips, or leaps. In fact, there's one more thing I want to do here, and that is we haven't really talked about unisons, but hopefully it's going to be self-evident once you see it. So as a reminder, if I start here on the first line and I repeat a note head on the same first line, that is a unison, which is also a size of 1. Okay, there I've said it, pretty obvious, right? Of course, if I go from a line to an adjacent space, either up or down, that's going to be a step. If I go from a line to a line, adjacent line, that's going to be a skip. If I go from a line to any other line, that's going to be, for example, here on the fourth line, that's going to be a compounded skip. In other words, some multiple of skips, right? Because we're adding them together. And do you remember what this is? Do you remember the visual reference for this? What this looks like? Well, that's one, two. That's one, two, three skips, which is, of course, a seventh. And then, very quickly, just before we move forward, do you remember what a seventh plus a step is? Well, that's going to be a step, right? So do you remember that three skips, one, two, three, plus a step yields an octave? You probably remember that, right? In other words, 7 plus 2, 9, minus 1, 8. Okay, I have to stop doing this. You guys just go back to the other videos, review the information, and then come back here and we'll continue from here. Okay, so this lesson is not so much about these review points, but rather about the concept of register. Okay, so let's talk about register. A register is a range of pitches. Now, the way that this has been applied so far is you might remember this, I showed you that from the lowest note head, right? Lowest meaning, because remember, as you move down the staff, it represents a lower pitch on the keyboard than, for example, something all the way at the top of the staff. So the space below the first line, all the way up to the space above the fifth line, this range, right? A range of pitches. This range is a size of 11. Please review the previous videos so that you can be clear about that, right? In other words, a set of compounded skips, correct? So the question is, this is all very abstract because, or the problem is, this is all very abstract because I'm not labeling any of these note heads with lettered pitches, right? If you go back to the first couple of videos, you remember that I arbitrarily had assigned the first line there, I had assigned that the letter A. That was completely arbitrary because I was going off of something called octave equivalence. Now, remember what that means. That octave equivalence states that I don't care which A I'm referring to because there are multiple A's on the keyboard, A0 all the way up to A7, right? There are 8 A's on the keyboard. So if I'm not indicating octave designation, right, A0, A1, A2, etc., then I'm talking about any A in the abstract sense. In other words, octave equivalence. All A's are the same for my purposes right now. But in this lesson, we're going to throw out octave equivalence and we're going to start actually worrying about register, that is, specific ranges of pitches as they occur throughout the keyboard space. So for this, we need to put together a quick little diagram of the keyboard without actually, I'm not going to draw any of the keys on the keyboard, but rather just, again, ranges. Okay, so for this, I need to clear out some space because I don't want all of this muddled. So on the left here, I'm going to represent A0. Remember, that is the lowest key on the modern Western keyboard. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, how about those Bösendorfer pianos? Well, maybe none of you are thinking of this because you might be beginners. But if you're not a beginner and you know that there are different manufacturers for pianos, for example, Steinway might be the arguably might be the most famous one, but there's also Yamaha's, and there's also this Austrian brand, which actually is now owned by Yamaha, Yamaha Corporation, which is the Bösendorfer brand. And Bösendorfer grand pianos actually build several extra keys below A0. Most of the time they're painted black as opposed to white and black, and they're sometimes covered with a lid so that it doesn't confuse the pianist. In fact, I've played on those Bösendorfers with those extra keys, and I can tell you if they're not covered and if they're not painted black, they are very confusing visually because you grow up and you learn how to play the instrument for, in my case, decades, and you do so with A0 all the way at the bottom range, and anything beyond that will throw you off. Kind of like I imagine if you're a Western driver and you end up overseas in England, for example, where you have to drive on the right side of the road and the steering wheel is on the right side of the car, it's probably very confusing at first. Anyway, I digress. So we're going to be dealing with not outliers like the Bösendorfer brand, but rather just the standard range of the Western keyboard. A0 on the left, C8 all the way at the top, and remember that we can basically divide the keyboard into two halves with C4 in the middle. So this range from A0 to C4 is a fairly large register, right? It's a large range of pitches in terms of size. In fact, let's figure it out. What's the size of A0 up to C4? And then what we're going to do is figure out the size of C4 up to C8, and then we're going to give them a name, these two individual registers, right, from A0 to C4, and then C4 to C8. So let's do that together. How do I figure out the size of A0 to C4? Well, we can do it the long way. Go find a keyboard and go A0, B0, C1, D1, E1, F1. I'm getting tired just saying this, but maybe just go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, etc., etc., etc. But you know what? We're smarter than that, right? A lot of my students constantly say to me, work smarter, not harder. And you know what? I get it. I may not always agree with that because sometimes I think you do have to work hard to learn how to work smart, which is why I always show you the long way. But let's work smarter because we already know how to do this. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to remember that C1 is just a couple of keys away from A0 as I move up the keyboard. Now, remember that if I have C1 here and C4 there, I know how many octaves this is, correct? Well, how many is it? It's 3 octaves. How do I know? Because I have an octave designation for C4, obviously another one for C1. 4 minus 1 is 3. That's how I know. If you need the extra visual reinforcement, C2, C3. This is 1 octave, this is a 2nd octave, and this is a 3rd octave, right? So that's pretty easy to figure out, right? 8 plus 8 plus 8, or 8 times 3, is 24, but don't I have to apply musical math? God, you guys have heard me say this so many times, but don't I have to subtract out the overlaps? Of course. Where are the overlaps between C1 and C4? At C2 and C3. So 24 minus 2 is 22. Am I done? Is that the interval size from A0 to C4? No, you should say to me. Of course not. That's from C1 to C4. Don't forget that we also have an interval from A0 up to C1 or C1 down to A0. What's that interval? Well, A0 plus a step is B0 plus the next step is C1. That is a skip, right? So obviously the answer here is 22 for the range from C1 to C4 plus 3 equals 25, and I'm done. Yeah? I hope you're paying attention because I've made a mistake. What have I forgotten to do? God, it'd be so funny if I mean, I'll never know if you're actually doing this, but is anyone shouting at me saying, no, you forgot to subtract out the overlap at C1? Because after all, you are looking at the range from A0 to C4, and along the way, you've got 1, 2, 3 overlaps. So I have already subtracted out 2 of those overlaps at C2 and C3. Now I have to do it at C1. So 25 minus 1 equals 24. Okay, that was long, but that's the correct answer. The interval size from A0 up to C4 is 24. Okay, okay. What are we going to call this? This is called the base register. Please notice that this word base is not spelled like baseball, B-A-S-E, but B-A-S-S. So just careful not to pronounce this bass, like you're about to go fishing, but rather just base. So that's the base register. It covers the range of pitches from C4 down to the leftmost key on the keyboard, A0. All that's the base. Now, what about from C4 to C8? Well, you know what? We're going to do this really quickly because we're dealing with two Cs, which means this is just some number of octaves, which is pretty easy to figure out. So let's do it. C4 up to C8, how many octaves is that? Well, we've got the octave designation for 8. Subtract 4, it's 4 octaves. If you need to see that visually, C5, C6, C7. And of course, we just keep going, right? That's an octave. That's an octave. I gotta clear this out. This is just, it's getting in the way, our previous work. But that's okay. All right, that's an octave. And of course, that's an octave. Do you guys see how that's 4 octaves? 1, 2, 3, and 4. So all we have to do is just add 8 plus 8 plus 8 plus 8, or 8 times 4, and that yields 32. But we're not done, obviously, because we have to subtract out the overlaps. How many overlaps are there? Well, there are 4 octaves. There are 3 overlaps. So the overlap is at C5, C6, and C7. So 32 minus 3 is 29. So the range of 4 octaves is 29. Now, obviously, as you compare these two numbers, all right, 24 over here and 29 up there, they're not the same. So if you thought earlier that when I split the keyboard into two parts at C4 that I was creating a perfectly divided keyboard where the distance or the size in the base register is the same as the one on top, that's not accurate. But C4 is a helpful reference point because it roughly bisects the keyboard into two parts. So the bass part, the bass register, is to the left of C4. What's to the right of C4? And the answer there is the treble register. The treble register. All right. No fancy pronunciation here, just treble. So the bass and the treble together, what do they sum to? Right? I just want to keep reviewing this because if you go back to the earlier videos where I'm in front of the keyboard, right, lessons 1 through 10 actually, what you'll notice is that we do figure out the size from A0 to C8, but here we have it in a very clear diagrammatic fashion, right? You can see the diagram. And so let's figure this out. And we should get the same answer. So I'm going to take 24 plus 29, the bass plus the treble. 24 plus 29. What does this equal? Oh no, big numbers. Actually, sometimes I have classes that are really, really mathematically oriented and they get the number quickly. Sometimes they don't. But the reason I'm talking right now is to give you time to figure it out. The answer here is 53. Is that the final answer? Well, no, because when we're adding intervals together, right, when we're compounding intervals, we always have to subtract out the overlap. I know you've heard me say this, I don't know, a dozen times, 24 times by this point, but it's so important because in our large scale 24 plus 29, bass plus treble, where are we overlapping? We're overlapping at C4. So we've got to subtract out one overlap, and the answer is 52. Did you get that this time? And do you remember getting 52 when we were working at the keyboard as the range, the interval size, from A0 up to C8? Okay, if you did, awesome. Hopefully this is just a nice little review. So once again, the two registers that basically organize the entire range of the keyboard into two roughly equal parts are the bass with an interval size of 24 letters from A0 up to C4, and the treble with a range or an interval size of 29 letters from C4 up to C8. And those are called the gross instrumental registers. Why gross? Large, like gross anatomy, right? So the large instrumental registers, the treble and the bass.